years ago, one of my non-gamer friend asked me a question. You always talk about first-person games and third-person games. You say you like first-person games more, but you never mentioned anything about second-person games. And I had no answer. After all those years, that friend is not a friend of mine anymore. But that question still makes me think about second-person games, how they look like. Why aren't there any second-person games? Or are there? So there are a lot of videos on YouTube explaining how a second person game would look like. This video with the most views explains with the example of a mission from a game called Driver San Francisco, where the main character of the game has the power to get in anyone's body and control them. In simple terms, what happens in this mission is that you, the player, controls the car in front of you while sitting in the car that's behind it. And that car follows the car in front that you are controlling. This does feel like a second-person perspective game, but once you think about it, this just feels like operating a remote-controlled car, with the only difference that you always stay near or in the view of that RC car. The other videos and explanations make it even more confusing. The thing that messes with my mind the most is that these different perspective games are referred to as I, we, and me for first-person games, they, she, and he for third-person games. And in second-person games, it should be referred as you. Simply put, in the first person, the player himself or herself is addressed, I, we, and me. Assume that you are the main character, and you are explaining to your friend about an incident that happened with you. You will say, I was walking back home from work, and suddenly a car crashed and flipped over right in front of me. This story is in first person. Now, if this happened with someone else, and you tell this story to that same friend, this story will sound like he was walking back home from work when a car suddenly crashed and flipped right in front of him. This becomes the third person. But in second person, this story will be about you and the car that crashed then flipped over. And it should sound like you were going back from home when a car suddenly crashed and flipped right in front of you. This sounds complicated, and it is. The complication is what makes it, well, senseless. Now, if this was true, and this was how first, second, and third person games were made, it would result in a story that would change with respect to the change in first person to the third person. But most of the games we play have the same story irrespective of the mode we play in, first person or the third person. Here in GTA 5, you can switch between first person and third person whenever you want. And switching between first and third person has no impact on the story. It stays the same. According to the concept of relation between the perspective and how the main character is addressed, a second person game would look like this, where this is the main character, and this character is controlled through a person or NPC that's looking at the main character and follows that character everywhere. To make it easy to understand, let's switch the NPC to a camera that is fixed, but it can look in different directions like a security camera. When the main character goes outside the view of this camera, it switches to some other camera to keep the main character in view. Then how such a game would look like? Well, there is one game that follows this concept called Headless Jeff 3. It's not released yet, but this trailer shows how it would look like. In this, the character has lost his head. It's separated from the body. We see the body through the eyes that are in the head and are still working. Then we control the body through the perspective of our eyes and move the body closer to rejoin with its head. This seems like a true second person game where we control our character from our perspective, and it follows the concept of addressing the character as you. But once you think about it in context of video games that have both first and third person, like the example of GTA 5, all this logic and explanation starts to fall apart. The second person concept used in Headless Jeff 3 is similar to the 2D platformer games, with the difference being that Headless Jeff 3 is 3D. And we can move anywhere in that 3D environment. We can get closer to the camera, we can get far from the camera as well. But does that mean that 2D platformer games are in second person with restricted movement? The concept of relating the first, the second, and the third person perspective to how they are addressed, I, we, you, he, they, and more, is fine when it comes to telling stories through books and movies. But when it comes to video games, this does not make much sense. Because in games, the perspective that we relate to, first, second, and third person, is actually point of view or POV. It's not about perspective, it's about where the camera is placed with respect to the character that we are controlling. It's all about the position of the camera. In first person, the camera is placed around the eyes or the head level. This camera decides what we, the ones who are playing the game and controlling the character, are going to see. That is why we see only the body that's underneath us and everything that's in front of us because of the camera. In third person, the camera is placed behind the character that we are controlling. It stays with the character and may move or shake slightly depending on the movement of the character that we are controlling and also the game. Now, what about the second person POV? Well, that's where all these complications mess up. In my opinion, if this is the first person POV, then this should be the second person POV. We all call it third person or over the shoulder POV, but it should be the second person POV. This makes more sense. The camera can be switched to an NPC but with the same properties. The NPC follows the main character and we, the player, control the main character from this POV or perspective if you want to call it. This becomes a bit similar to the mission in Driver San Francisco where the player controls the car in front and the car behind automatically follows the other car but with some obvious differences. Like the camera in third person is more or less fixed at a specific distance behind the character, while in Driver San Francisco, the camera is placed inside the car that is again behind the character. With one other difference that in Driver San Francisco, the second car is being driven by AI that makes its own way to stay behind the car that we are controlling. All this seems similar to some driving games that have this camera angle. Not exactly the same, but you get the point. Now, if this is the second person POV, then what about third person POV? Well, there is no need of a third person POV. Why, you may ask? Well, if there has to be a third person POV, then there has to be a fourth person POV as well, and fifth and sixth and so on. This is not like the 3 dimensions that all these have to exist. This is about what we see and how much we see in video games. All these complications are not necessary at all. It's just about our view, what we see and what we don't see in a game, because games do not work like real life. Games are different. For example, the weapons in games look like they work similarly to what we see in real life, but they do not. In most first-person shooter games, the gun that we see is just a placeholder that does not shoot anything, but it's made to look like that the weapon shoots bullets. And I have explained everything in detail in this video. The same goes for a lot of other mechanics in games. Especially in racing games, we have a follow-up POV cam. But in real life, driving with such view is next to impossible. Therefore, the different person POV is a thing that's confined in the gaming ecosystem. Some of it works like real and represents real life, but other things are just unique to the gaming world. The point of this video is not to prove anyone wrong. I just wanted to share a perspective that in my opinion feels right. And I would love to know your opinions as well. The video about how guns work in games is on screen and linked in the description as well. You can watch it. I have made it really easy to understand.